Hello, and welcome to the analysis of the pre-seen information for Management Case Study, May 2018. My name's Helen Crofts. You should watch this analysis after you have read through the pre-seen information at least once. It is expected that as you proceed through this analysis, you will need to pause to think about the information in the pre-seen, as well as answering some questions which will help you to think more deeply about the company. Make notes on your answers to these questions and bring them with you to the classroom course so that we can discuss them together. This analysis will take each section of the pre-seen information and pull out the useful snippets, and also question the information we have and what it might mean. So the first section is just an introduction, but does give us some useful bits to remember. We are dealing with a bus company called Menta. The company is multinational, has a large number of employees and has existed for some time. We also need to refer here to the currency, which is Centralian dollars. As is usual with Management Case, you play the part of a financial manager, and although your main area is the Central Eurozone, the examiner has opened this up to potentially include other regions too, so anything is fair game. We then have a section on state involvement in the bus industry. Although we are told here that there's been a move away from state regulation, it is important to realise that this doesn't mean the industry is totally unregulated. We also find out here that grants may be available to operate certain bus routes, and this is something we will revisit later in the pre-seen. We have quite a lot of information about the company history, and we need to make sure we don't get too bogged down in irrelevant facts here and focus on the stuff that might be useful in our understanding of the company. The company has a family history, and members of the original Whiteford family are still involved. This might affect their willingness to make changes, but also implies that there is a lot of experience within the senior management of the company, which may prove useful. We also learn that changes in the law have allowed bus companies to operate without a route licence in Centralia. Note that we don't know if this is the case for all the countries in which Menta operates. It seems that Menta can be quite aggressive as a competitor, cutting prices and effectively forcing other bus companies out of business. Add this to your list of ethical issues which may affect them in the future. They have grown largely through acquisition, so expect to see more of this in the future. They have also acquired businesses and stripped the bits out that interest them, as they have done with North East Airport. This is an interesting strategy which we may see repeated in the unseen. Although they have been involved in other transport services, notably trams, they are currently focusing on bus services. Make sure you don't miss things that are only briefly mentioned. For example, we are told right at the end of this section that they are dominant in Centralia, something we may want to refer back to. We then have 3 pages which cover the group strategy and structure. Key elements of the strategy to highlight. Organic growth, not how they've grown so far. Safety and reliability is important to them. They may be looking at complementary businesses. What examples can you think of here? And they have a strategy of bidding for tram franchises. This is the only place in the pre-seen where this is mentioned, and we have no further information, so at least one of the exam variants may develop this further. We are given 2 group structure diagrams on page 6 and 8. They don't seem completely consistent in terms of where finance, operations and sales and marketing sits, whether centrally or divisionally. And this is something that may well be clarified in the unseen information. We also found out, on page 6, that they have a large number of bus depots. We can think about how they may operate more and whether there is scope for improving efficiencies in this area of the business. At the bottom of page 6, we can see that each operating unit has its own fleet. It is not clear what optimised for local conditions might mean, but if there are any suggestions in the exam of sharing fleet where there is maybe some spare capacity, then transfer pricing may come into play. We can also see that each type of route, whether it is city, intercity or rural, uses a different type of bus, and so there isn't flexibility to move the buses around according to demand. Let's have a think about a question. Can you evaluate the organisational structure? What are the pros and cons? Take 10 to 15 minutes to make some notes on this and bring your notes with you on the classroom course. Here is a short section on the regulatory environment. It reminds us that Centralia has deregulated bus route licensing and informs us that this applies to most, but not necessarily all, of the governments we are dealing with. We also know that there is a lot of local government regulation. This makes them a key player, given the amount of revenue meant to generate from these subsidies. In many ways, the revenue for Mentor is very simple. They earn revenue for operating a bus service. There are different types of ticket on offer, such as single tickets or season tickets, although they don't appear to offer a return ticket. They also receive money back from the government for every concession fare they sell. This is likely to mean they are subject to government audits to check that the information they are using to invoice the government is accurate. There is no mention of concessions for younger people, something that may be introduced in some countries. They have clearly adopted technology in their operations. Tickets can be bought online and then scanned on the bus. They also receive subsidies as a lump sum for certain routes and are paid by the school boards for the pupil transport services they provide. This table shows that 55% of their overall revenue is generated in some way from central or local government. Another indication of the power of this stakeholder and the need to keep them happy. Also note that they have to tender for their contracts. You may have to think about techniques such as relevant costing in determining suitable prices for such tenders. The fact that they are transporting pupils enhances the need to make sure the drivers are properly licensed with the appropriate background checks. We have some fairly detailed information on the Centralian market, but note that this section does seem to only refer to Centralia. You may be provided with similar information for a different market in the exam. 70% of the company's revenue is generated in Centralia, yet they only have a 30% share of this market. This provides scope for further market penetration, although that would serve to increase the power of the Centralian government even more. Mentor would then be very exposed to changes in government policy or a conflict with its government contacts. Mentor also believes that the overall market in Centralia could expand through encouraging passengers to change their mode of transport. Currently, bus travel is the least popular form of transport for shorter journeys, followed by walking and cycling. Imagine what would happen if the Centralian government, to encourage a healthy lifestyle, launched a shared bike scheme, similar to that in London. What would that do to the revenue? It does seem that the government is currently very much in favour of bus transport and therefore provides a lot of support to the industry. Let's have a think about another question. you perform a stakeholder mapping exercise using something like Mendelow's matrix? Mendelow's matrix identifies who the stakeholders are and how powerful and interested they are. This exercise should take you about 15 minutes. There is a brief mention here of driverless buses, a huge change to the operations of Mentor and a big impact on a workforce of 35,000 staff, many of whom are likely to be drivers. Mentor obviously generates a lot of operational information, and you may be provided with some of this in the exam and asked to interpret what you were told. Another suggestion here that the company is quite aggressive with the competition. We are told that local competitive monitoring happens, and then it seems that head office make the decisions as to whether action is taken. This suggests that business is not fully decentralised and therefore may be quite inefficient in terms of how decisions are made. This section gives us some information on the competition, albeit fairly limited. The main competitor in Centralia is Doorbus, and we have further information on this company later on in the pre-scene. We are told that they are slightly bigger than Mentor in Centralia, which must make them very powerful, as we've already been told that Mentor is dominant. It is interesting that Mentor seem to behave very nicely with Doorbus, and yet are very happy to be aggressive with other competitors. Note that Mentor does not currently have a service in every town, and so some local companies have an effective monopoly. If Mentor decided to move into these areas, they could quite quickly put the local company out of business. Not something that would be considered particularly ethical. Also note here that their western region is just intercity services, and eastern is just city buses. Something we might need to refer to later on. So let's do a bit of analysis of the external environment. The first thing to think about is the general operating environment. Can you perform a PESTLE analysis of Mentor, thinking about political, economic, social, technological, environmental and legal factors affecting the business? This is a quite detailed analysis, so it should take you about 20 minutes. Once you have thought about the general environment, we can then think about looking at the more immediate operating environment. The next thing to do is perform a 5 forces analysis, thinking of the power that competition, suppliers, customers, new entrants and substitutes might have on Mentor. When you are thinking about new entrants, consider what the barriers to entry may be in this market. And when you are thinking about substitutes, think about whether the substitutes you've identified, such as other transport services, offer a similar service for a similar price. The next 4 pages, page 14 to 17, provide us with various bits of information about the costing of the Mentor activities. We have some information here about each type of bus. These are averages, as each type of service operates buses with a range of different seating capacities. If we had information on what the implications would be of replacing these buses maybe before or after the end of their expected lives, so for example how this would change the residual value, we could calculate the optimal replacement cycle. The approach to doing this is calculating the equivalent annual cost. Not something you will have to prepare in the exam, but possibly something you will have to interpret. It seems interesting that the city buses don't have seatbelts, given that part of Mentor's strategy is to provide a safe service. This may be one way that the government decides to exert some of their considerable power over Mentor. We also discover that the company maintains the vehicles to a high standard. This ensures that they don't have to deal with unforeseen costs from breakdowns, for example. We may face a situation in the exam where this high standard has not been maintained. How has this happened? What are the implications? How can we fix it? Make sure you read all of the data provided carefully. For example, the table at the bottom of this first page 14. Looking at the fuel economy. If you drive, you are probably familiar with fuel economy being in terms of miles per gallon. Even though we are dealing with kilometres and litres here, we are given the data in the opposite way. So the fuel per distance rather than the distance per unit of fuel. This means that the city buses are the least economical and the intercity the most, which is what we would expect given the driving conditions. Over the page, it is interesting to see that each vehicle needs 2.5 drivers per day. This means that given an operational day is 15 hours, the operational shifts are fairly short, 6 hours long. There may well be health and safety reasons for this, but there also may be an opportunity for improved efficiency. Another area of health and safety that results in inefficiency is the fact that each intercity journey requires 2 drivers, although it is not clear whether there is anything which can be done on this. Now it's time for you to do some work on the remaining information we have here. So, a question. Can you read through the information you have on page 14 to 17, evaluate it, and identify 5 useful and interesting bits of information, things that I haven't already pointed out to you. Bring these bits along with you to the classroom course. We are now provided with the financial statements for both Mentor and Doorbus. Before we do any detailed analysis, let's see what the headline figures tell us. Revenue is up, yet operating costs have remained the same. This may be as a result of price increases on various routes, without any corresponding increases in costs. Can you think of why that might be? Finance costs have fallen, but that is in line with the reduction in borrowings we can see on the statement of financial position. We can calculate the effective tax rate by taking the taxation expense and dividing it by profit before tax. The effective tax rate has fallen from 24% in 2016 to 22%. This could just be due to a change in the revenue mix across the different countries, which may have different tax rates. Given the importance of the government relationships, let's hope they are not doing anything suspicious with their tax calculations. Looking at the statement of financial position, it seems that they have acquired new subsidiaries during the year, as goodwill has increased. This can't all be accounted for by the movement in the translation reserve. There also seems to be a considerable increase in property, plant and equipment, although this could be the additional assets they have taken on through the business that they have acquired. Trade receivables have fallen despite an increase in revenue, which suggests there are no concerns with the government's paying over the subsidies. As well as paying off some loans, share capital and share premium have increased, so they have obviously issued some shares during the year. After Centralia, the remaining central area is the biggest contributor of revenue, but Asia contributes more in operating profit terms. Some margin analysis may be useful here, and you must consider the possible reasons, even if we aren't given those reasons in the pre-seen information. These are the financial statements for Dawlbus. Dawlbus is smaller than Menta in revenue terms, but that is to be expected, as it only operates in Centralia. Although we are told earlier on that Dawlbus has a slightly higher market share, we can now see that their revenue is 19% higher than Menta's Centralia revenue, which seems quite considerable. There aren't any significant changes in Dawlbus's financial position, although they have also paid off some of their loans during the year. So now let's do some analysis of these financial statements. Again, over to you for the hard work. The question is calculate the key ratios for Menta and where possible for Dawlbus. Remember your F2 recap. We want to consider the financial performance, liquidity and gearing. Can you calculate return on capital employed, operating profit margin, asset utilisation? Can you also calculate some liquidity ratios? So the current ratio, inventory days, receivables days and payables days. Finally, can you calculate the gearing ratios? So gearing, the proportion of debt to equity, and also interest cover. Once you have calculated those ratios, think about what those ratios might mean by comparing them year on year and between Menta and Dawlbus. Bring your analysis with you to the classroom course. The final section of the pre-seen material gives us a few newspaper articles to mull over. First, we have a story about a school bus accident where the public are getting upset that the school bus is not fitted with seat belts. It's possible that government may change the regulations here. There is then a story about local services declining. It points out that it only costs $50 to register a new route, and therefore some local competition is being put out of business by larger companies moving into the area. We then have an article about a particular company, Jaria Buses, which was forced out of business, according to the article, by Menta, moving into the area, cutting prices, putting the company out of business, and then increasing their fares by 20%. Finally, we are given a story about some environmental issues facing Menta, in particular the impact that a diesel bus will have on the environment. Now you have read those articles and also taken into account the other information we are provided with, can you now think about the potential ethical issues which may affect Menta? You may also want to think about what kind of actions Menta can take to protect themselves from these issues. Now that you have read through all of the information and performed some preliminary analysis, it's time to try and pull it all together. The final task is to identify the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats for Menta. This should require some fairly detailed analysis using all of the notes we've taken so far. Aim for at least 7 or 8 points under each heading, and don't worry too much about whether you've got the right headings. Just make sure you've got a good summary of Menta. Bring this analysis with you to the classroom course for discussion. It should take you a reasonable amount of time, about 25 minutes to half an hour. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope you have found it useful. Your next steps, you probably need to reread the pre-seen information to make sure you have picked up absolutely everything. Review the analysis you have performed. Are there any gaps in your understanding? And then, before the classroom course, attempt the mock exam.